Okay, so welcome everyone to our September meeting. I'm going to introduce our speaker, Emma Waltman. Emma, whenever you'd like, you're free to share your screen. So Emma Waltman is a PhD candidate at Rutgers University studying ecology and evolution. She is co-advised by Dr. Ann Nielsen. She's co-advised by Dr. Ann Nielsen and Julie Lockwood. Her dissertation research focuses on the role of habitat and landscape composition in predicting pest control of stink bugs by insect parasitoids and predators in New Jersey orchards. She utilizes a combination of field, laboratory, and geospatial techniques in her research. Before starting her PhD, Emma got her bachelor's degree at Washington University in St. Louis, where she conducted research on plant disease caterpillar systems. Her research tracked development time, growth rate, and uptake by the common buckeye caterpillars fed plantain plants infected with fungal disease compared to those fed healthy plants. Long term, Emma is interested in improving sustainable, ecologically informed agriculture management to control agricultural insect pest and crop disease. In her free time, she likes to hike, backpacking, drawing, playing soccer, insects.
Uh-oh.
Today, her talk will introduce the configuration of landforms surrounding a particular location, influence ecological dynamics and species abundance of the organisms present there. We will present general information about landscape ecology and go through interesting studies about how landscapes impact insects, specifically aphids and butterflies, and she will introduce aspects of her own research and explain how she studies landscape ecology to understand the dynamics between stink bugs and their parasitoid wasp and insect predators in agricultural systems. So Emma, I'm going to mute, and the floor is all yours. We can see your screen perfectly.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, Jen. Jen and I are both grad students at Rutgers, and I appreciate your invitation. So thank you so much. I also am so happy to be joined by all of you on this evening. I'm excited. I love butterflies. Y'all love butterflies. Let's get into it. So today I'll also say if you have any questions along the way, you can put it in the chat and I'll probably get to it at the end and maybe we can do a little Q&A or discussion because I think we'll have some time for it. But as Jen said, I'm going to introduce the subfield of ecology called landscape ecology. I'm going to provide you with a bit of a primer of the field and also introduce you to some case studies, some of which are not my own, but some of which are my own research. And I'll get started. Oh, there we go. Okay, I kind of just said that, haha. But I will mention that the case study we'll be talking about is a Nick Haddad paper that maybe some of you are familiar with because I know he has a great book on butterflies out. And if you're not familiar with that book, definitely look it up. All right, so here I am with some pinned insects. I was recently a teaching assistant for one of our undergraduate entomology classes at Rutgers, and this is my sample collection here. As Jen said, I'm a PhD candidate at Rutgers, advised by Ann Nielsen and Julie Lockwood. Ann Nielsen is an extension specialist in entomology, so she works with farmers across New Jersey to provide them with advice in how to manage their insect pests, specifically in fruit. And Julie Lockwood is an invasive ecologist who has a great molecular DNA lab that I'm fortunate to get to use for my research. I'm originally from New Jersey. I'm from Hopewell in Mercer County. If we have any people familiar with the area. And yeah, I'm glad to be back. I went out of state for college and really got some great experiences in ecology. So I got to work in the forest, in the Ozarks in Missouri, and then go abroad to South Africa as an undergrad there, where I studied a skin disease of giraffes. If you look closely, you can see a gross little gray patch on this giraffe's neck. So that's what I was studying during my time there. And because I'm speaking to a bunch of butterfly enthusiasts, I'll explain a bit of my background with lepidopterans. I worked as a senior undergrad and then a bit after my undergrad with the common buckeye butterfly, which I'm sure you're all familiar with because we have them in New Jersey. And as Jen kind of mentioned, I worked in an experiment there where I fed them diseased and healthy plants, just ribwort plantain. And I was able to find that when they were fed plants that were infected with powdery mildew, they actually took a day longer to form their chrysalis, although they didn't, there was no mortality effects of the disease. So they were still able to live. They still were able to weigh the same. They just took a bit longer to develop. Also, interestingly, they had, I believe, higher levels of potassium. We don't fully know why. But this was my first experience working with insects. I raised all these caterpillars. I actually wild caught the butterflies in the St. Louis area and then raised all of these caterpillars. So they were all full siblings. So we could rule out any maternal line genetic differences as to why they might develop differently. So I love the common buckeye, great butterfly. So after my research technician job, a little thing called COVID happened, and I moved back home to New Jersey, and then I got a job with Rutgers Agricultural Extension. And I drove to, it was a great job for the pandemic, I'll say, because I was outside and alone all day. And I drove to 10 different farms a week and checked fruit crop for insect, pests, and disease. So here we have a peach that's been riddled with fruit flies. Here we have a scale insect infecting an apple, and there's a lepidopteran interior borer eating this apple from the inside here. And I loved working in agriculture. It was a way for me to study insects and study ecology, but in a very applied way. And because I'm very dedicated, or like I really want to make a difference sustainability and climate wise, I thought agriculture was a cool way to do research in an applied setting. Um, yeah, and then this is a really kind of complicated figure that I'm going to come back to. So I'm not going to explain it yet, but this is kind of what I'm doing now. And sneak peek, we'll get back to it. Um, and now I will stop talking about myself and switch gears a little bit and explain what landscape ecology is. Some of you, I know this is a mixed group, so we might have some people who are familiar with it, some people who are not familiar with it. I am definitely not an expert, but I've taken a few courses in it, and I'm very interested in that field. So that's why I chose to talk about it today. So a quick definition of a landscape is an area that is spatially heterogeneous in at least one factor of interest. So here, there's an example landscape. I believe this is a like nursery area. So you're growing trees here for people to take and plant in their homes, surrounded by forest. Over here, we might have some sort of horticultural crop. We have some tilled plots right now. And so this is an example of a landscape. And then an example or a quick definition of ecology is the study of relationships between living organisms with other organisms and or their physical environment. So if this orange butterfly is interacting, if we're studying how it interacts with a tree, a bird, or members of its own species, this kind of figure represents ecology. And then landscape ecology is the study of how landscapes affect the ecological processes and vice versa. So if this butterfly is in the nursery area or in this could be like corn, let's say, in a corn plot versus in the forest, is it going to interact with members of its own species or abiotic or biotic actors in a different way is kind of a way to describe landscape ecology. And I will say a lot of the landscape ecology information that I'm presenting today is from a textbook written by Turner and Gardner. The newest edition came out in 2015. It's called, I actually am using it to hold up my laptop. It's called Landscape Ecology in Theory and Practice. If you happen to really be interested and want to learn more, it's a pretty easy to read and comprehensive book. So landscape ecology is concerned with these three main things. One is both spatial composition and spatial configuration. So composition, as you can see in this little figure here, composition is just how much of a certain landscape type you have in a certain area, versus configuration is something like how many small patches you have in an area. What's an example is a perimeter to area ratio. So if you, here we have just as much black area in landscape B as we do in landscape A, but obviously in landscape B, each of the patches is much smaller, and that can have effects on organisms and the ecology. And then, yeah, so that's kind of a big actor in landscape ecology. Landscape ecology also kind of emerged as its own particular subfield because it's interested in extents that are a lot larger than those traditionally studied in ecology. And lastly, it's concerned with flows of organisms and nutrients among different landscape elements or patches. So like up here, landscape A only has 2 patches and landscape B has 8 patches, even though the composition of different landscape, I guess, landscape types is the same. Two large overarching theories in ecology that kind of paved the way for landscape ecology to emerge as its own subfield is island biogeography theory and metapopulation theory. I'll just quickly give a description of each. So island biogeography theory, this is landmark ecological theory published by Edward O. Wilson, Robert MacArthur in the 40s. And basically, if you have a mainland, which in this figure, you can see this is our mainland, that has a species pool or just a group of different species that exist in them. And you have islands that are separated here, the probability or the likelihood that a certain species will reach a particular island off the mainland increases with the island size. So larger islands are more likely to get colonized by different species, and decreases with distance to the mainland. So if an island is farther away from the mainland, you are likely going to have fewer different species that make it there, because not all of them will have the ability to travel long distances. And an interesting way to think about island biogeography theory is also that it doesn't have to necessarily be islands. So it can also be isolated, very distinct habitat patches that are surrounded by habitat that's somehow uninhabitable. So, for instance, a bunch of like the New York City park system, the parks in Manhattan are surrounded by an ocean in a metaphorical sense of urbanized area. So, but the island biogeography theory has still is at play in that setting. And then metapopulation theory was termed by Simon Levins in 1969. And similarly, if you have many isolated patches of habitat in the same large scale area, and you're concerned with just one particular species, so species A, this whole area, all of the individuals of species A in one area form one metapopulation. And here the blue or the filled in patches are the areas where there are individuals of species A, and the white are there's none. And the arrows can then indicate like movement of a species from one area to another. If you go to if you look at a different time of the same area, there might be some local extinctions where now there's no more of that species in an area, but then other areas might now have it. And this is kind of termed the blinking lights metaphor. And what stems from this, I'm not gonna go into this math, so don't worry if you're like me and a little bit math adverse. But basically, if you model this and you have a colonization rate of A, so how much that's individuals of that species move from one area to another, and an extinction rate, so how often the species goes extinct in one of your patches, the metapopulation will persist, or there will still be that species there if you're having a higher colonization rate than extinction rate. Hopefully that kind of made sense. Kind of moving to the future a little bit into modern times, landscape ecology in the last, like probably since the year 2000 has kind of exploded because of the accessibility and improvements in aerial photography and satellite imagery, also in digital remote sensing. So photos taken by drones is what that refers to. And there's also been more accessible data put out. So for instance, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection every 5 years goes out and tries to map like the location or categorize every, I think it's in a like 3 by 3 meter, I don't know exactly the scale, but they go out and they try to map like every inch of land in New Jersey and then publish that data. So then you can see like how much urbanized, how much farmland, how much forest, how much water do we have in the state. And here's Morris County categorized by these different land use categories. And then also ArcGIS or geographic information systems and other types of software are pretty commonly used now to be able to calculate landscape variables and then look at ecological data with that to kind of understand how the surrounding land affects the ecology of it. Insect, I am not going to go into this, but this is just different ways to categorize your land by the software. And today, I would say the field is concerned with like a few main sub areas. So one of them is how does landscape affect community and population ecology dynamics? And I'll give an example of that. At what scale does landscape impact a certain taxa or group of taxa the most? So if we're thinking about butterflies, even the same species, but at a different life stage, so a caterpillar is probably going to be impacted at a much smaller landscape scale than a butterfly, just because the caterpillar cannot fly and is working in a much smaller area. So maybe it doesn't need a whole beautiful meadow to do well. It just needs a tiny urban park to do well, or something like that. That's kind of what I mean by scale questions there. There's also some interest in testing the effectiveness of corridors for conservation biology, and this is the kind of fits in, or this is what motivated the Haddad study that I'm going to talk about later. And then how does landscape affect pest control services? And that's kind of where my research fits in. And that's by no means exhaustive. There's a lot of other areas as well, but I thought I'd leave it at that for today. An example of how landscape can affect community and population ecological dynamics is this kind of iconic case study by Robert Huffaker in 1963. And basically, he made these arenas with oranges. So here and I will say, this is, we're thinking landscape, thinking big. This is actually a very small scale study, but it's been found that in large scale, there's kind of similarities. Sorry for that diversion. Okay, so there's a bunch of oranges laid out here, and then he also has an area of a similar spatial extent or a similar area where there's a few oranges, but a bunch of rubber balls in between the oranges. And I couldn't find a picture of it, but in some cases, he also introduced three-dimensional aspects. So he had little threads that were basically like power lines in this arena as well. And what he found is that with the same starting number of tiny mites that eat other mites, so predator mites, and pest mites that eat oranges, when there's a simple habitat that was all oranges, almost every time the pest mites, so the prey, would go to extinction. So the predators would eat all of them. And then when starting with the same number in a complex habitat with the rubber balls, so that the mites didn't like, and with like little tight ropes, here we have jumping off posts for prey mites. The two mite species would coexist for much longer. And so basically the prey mites would be able to hide and be able to escape their predators in this complex arena. And that kind of this study is talked about a lot in ecology, not just landscape ecology, but like predator prey dynamics, things like that, to talk about how the space around or the space in which different species interact in can really change the outcome of their ecological relationship. So moving along with the idea of scale, I just wanted to show this figure really quick. There's a lot of words here. Don't really worry about the words. Basically, this was just a study that was able to, through marking and recapturing, figure out the foraging distance for two different bees, and found that this Tetragonula carbonaria, a tiny bee, has a very small foraging distance compared to the European honeybee. And foraging distance is just kind of, I don't know exactly actually how it's defined, but I think it refers to like the area that it will go each day to look for pollen and things like that. So if we were designing a landscape ecology study for these two different bees, we're going to be looking at a much different scale for both of them, is basically my takeaway here. The other area that that landscape ecology is concerned with, another one that I talked about, was testing the effectiveness of corridors for conservation biology. And this gets into, in conservation biology, which is a field that tries to decide like which areas are most important to be conserved if you have a limited amount of space that you can protect from development or something like that. Should you go with a single large conserved area or several small? And to be honest with you, there's no right answer here. People put out studies defending one of them all the time. But you can see in this area, half of K, so like one contiguous habitat in B, versus in C, a bunch of small habitats, there's still the same area of green. It's just functionally, for a lot of different organisms, it's probably going to be much more effective, perhaps, to do the single large. But then for other different types of especially insects, some actually really like edges. So for those organisms, they might actually like the several small more. Um, there has been a suggestion to use corridors to connect habitat fragments to help deal with things like inbreeding depression. So like if you don't have enough functional or genetic diversity, you can do that, or like for certain organisms that need to migrate over long areas. There's this idea to introduce corridors. So here's an example of a corridor of a green space that goes over a highway. So theoretically, organisms that cannot fly can go to both of these different patches instead of having to cross a highway. And here's where I'm going to talk a bit about butterflies. So this is one study by Nick Haddad, who is this man here. He's a professor at Michigan State, I believe. And it's on corridors and distance effects on inner patch movements, a landscape experiment with butterflies. And he specifically looked at the common buckeye butterfly, which of course is one of my favorites, as I talked about because I worked with it, and the variegated fritillary. He was interested in how corridors and the distance between patches affect inner patch movement rates of those two butterflies, who are open habitat butterflies. And in a large forested area, so the kind of white habitat here, it was old loblolly and slash pines, with very little flowering resources for butterflies in those forested areas. I think they were previously logged areas. And basically, I'm actually going to go to the next slide, but I'm going to come back. They cut down the pine trees in areas and then also let flowering plants, grow there. And these open habitats are much better for butterflies specifically because there's more flowering resources. So they made these open habitats to support a diverse flowering community, and then saw if these two butterflies that like open habitats with lots of flowers would move in between the squares more often when the squares were connected to each other. And they had 4 different distances between the square habitats. 64 meters to the longest was 384. And they did the clearing in 1994 and then collected data in 1995 and 1996 in a South Carolina site. Here again is the site. I will say he has published, I don't know, maybe at least 8, somewhere between 8 and 20. I haven't fully paid attention of how many papers have come out from this site, but Nick Haddad has published a lot of different papers using this experimental site. So if this is interesting to you, I definitely recommend looking up his name. So in the sites, he and his research team first tried seeing what butterflies would come there. They eventually supplemented them by actually releasing butterflies into the patches. But they would catch butterflies with a net, record stick, or I think they just wrote on in marker a number on their wing, recorded like where they found them, what sex they were, and then would re-release them into the patches over the summer in those 2 years. And then they also had a hypothesis that specifically the presence of these 3 plants, so I think that's blue toad flags, rubus, so brambles, and butterfly milkweed. They were curious if when these plants were present in large numbers, if that would also increase the likelihood of finding butterflies in a particular square patch. And I'll kind of just explain a few of the most interesting results. So At larger interpatch distances, butterfly movement was more common between connected patches, but not at the smallest distance. And that just means that the butterflies were, perhaps they could see that there was a clearing through the trees at 64 meters. They seem to move in between unconnected patches at the smallest distance fine. But then once you get to over 100 meters, they move between two distances that are connected with a corridor a lot more often than if they're not connected with a corridor. And basically, the black lines here, and they also separate it. So here's the buckeye Quinnia in 1995 and 1996, and then the fritillary in 1995 and 1996. The dark lines are, it's basically like the proportion of the butterflies that moved in between patches. The dark line is if there's a corridor, and the dotted line is if there's not. The take home here is that the dark line is always higher than the spotted line if you're at greater than the lowest distance, because the x-axis is like how far away the two corridors were from each other. So they're always moving between corridors more often if they're 128 or higher number of meters away from each other if there's a corridor. And statistically, they found that this was the case, other than for buckeyes in 1995, but they thought that may have been a sample size issue. Also, interestingly, males of both butterflies showed stronger positive responses to corridors than females. And they hypothesized that the females might be better at dispersing in general. So the males will be more affected by the corridors because they generally wouldn't disperse that far without the corridors. And one other thing to take away from the study is they actually only found that one of the food plants, the blue toadflax, was made it more likely to find a butterfly in a specific area, and that was only for the buckeyes. So they didn't find that the plants available in a certain patch really had as much of a effect on if you were likely to find the butterflies there or not, as they had expected. To take away from this study and think about impacts for conservation, interestingly, different species, and actually even like different, sexes of one species can have different responses to corridors. So that makes everything a little more tricky when you're trying to conserve a bunch of different organisms in one area compared to just one particular species of conservation concern, for example. In this instance, corridors did increase dispersal for two of the two butterflies, suggesting that they could be useful for connecting protected lands and might decrease potential inbreeding effects if like there's a very isolated path. And like I said, you can check out Dr. Haddad's many other studies in this particular system to learn more. Yeah, okay. And then the last thing I wanted to talk to y'all about is how landscape can affect pest control services, and give you a bit of an idea of what I do research on, although I'll say my research is not at the point yet, unfortunately, where it can be, wrapped up in a nice bow and you can get takeaway messages. I'm still going through a lot of my data. And yeah, unpublished, as I said. So let's see. It's a little bigger here. I'm just going to explain. Actually, I'll do this first and then I'll explain this figure. So there have been a number of studies, again, generally in the last, since the year 2000 around, especially for the agricultural landscape ecology. There have been studies that have found that more natural land surrounding farms will increase natural enemy abundance and control of pests. When I say natural enemies, I generally mean predator insects that eat other insects, and parasitoid wasps, which are tiny wasps that do not sting you, but they actually find eggs of other insects or sometimes arachnids, lay their eggs inside of those eggs. They're developing embryo will eat the developing stink bug and then they'll hatch out. So generally they will have a negative impact on the population of their host. And when their host is an agricultural pest, that's a good thing. And I just listed some of the ecologists and researchers who have done work in that area. So Mary Gardiner, I always can't say his name quite correctly, but I believe he's a German researcher, Doug Landis, Monica Turner, and more. But I will say this is not always the case, that more natural land means better pest control naturally by other insects. I'm curious how landscape affects egg mortality of two specific stink bugs by natural enemies in New Jersey orchards. My stink bugs of interest are Halomorphios, which is the brown marmorated stink bug, which probably many of you are familiar with because it will come into your house over the winter and it's invasive and a pest. And then there's the spined soldier bug, Pedicis maculoventris, which is actually a beneficial because it's a predator itself. And I integrate different methods, so field, geospatial, and molecular techniques to answer that question. I'm curious if the surrounding landscape, so like percent forest, percent corn, percent urban in, let's say, a 1 kilometer radius around a farm, if that will impact how often these natural enemies are killing stink bugs. Here I am with my stink bugs. So last summer, I raised a bunch of stink bugs. I had them lay eggs, and I put out their eggs at different farms across New Jersey. Here I am putting out eggs. I would not let them hatch, so I grabbed them after 3 days, and I was able to monitor like if any of the eggs had been predated or parasitized. And here are my different farms. It's possible some of you have gone to some of these farms. I generally was in northern and central New Jersey here. And 2-3 kilometers around each of these farms, I am in the process of classifying every block of land as one of these different landscape categories. I won't go through all of them, but for example, corn, soybean, tree fruit, forest, meadow, water, and urban. And I am still working on my GIS stuff. This is just a little glimpse of how that looks. I'm using satellite imagery from this company called Nearmap, and it's actually so good. It's crazy how clear this satellite imagery is. ArcGIS, which is a software that lets me classify land, and some of the Department of Environmental Protection data. I'm not going to go through all of this. Basically, I am looking at the eggs that I put out after I froze them. And I'm looking, this is kind of what they look like under a microscope. I'm dissecting them. Some of them I'm putting into these like plates. And if I think that there's a parasitoid, but I can't tell what species it is, I'm actually extracting their DNA and using PCR and sequencing to figure out what species of wasp was there. And here are my hypotheses, and this is where I'll leave. So I think that more natural land surrounding farms will predict higher stink bug egg mortality. I think that higher diversity in landscapes will also predict higher species richness or higher number of different species of parasitoid wasps that I can detect. I am gonna see if landscape composition at different scales is best at statistically predicting my egg mortality. And I think that the highest scale I'm looking at is going to be the most, the best at predicting it. And I also think that the native stink bug, the pedicis or the spined soldier bug, is going to have higher rates of egg mortality than the invasive ones. I just wanted to say my research for my PhD is supported by a number of funding sources. So like USDA Sustainable Agricultural Research and Education Program, the New Jersey State Horticultural Society, and some support for my grad program. I've also had 4 really incredible undergraduate assistants help me with my research. Anne and her lab was really helpful in designing this particular project. And also I have a network of 15 very generous and flexible farmers who let me do work on their property, which was really incredible of them. If anyone wants to reach me with any particular landscape ecology or insect question, you can contact me. There's my email. And if there's any questions, I would love to take them. Thank you all so much for your time. I know the evening is a bit tough sometimes, so I really appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you, Jen, for inviting me.
Okay, guys, let me switch my view so I could see everybody again, because I was just looking just at Emma. Okay. If anybody has any questions, please feel free, whatever you're more comfortable with, either unmuting or typing it in the chat and I will read them. But actually, Emma, I have a question.
Sure.
So when we were talking about different corridors, the half K or then the scattered K, do you see that one is more common in regards to like agriculture? Because I know when we have different
Mm.
agriculture crop fields, I'm not too familiar. It's been a while. But
You
when we
mean,
have, yeah, these. Do you see one is more
um,
common near farms than the other? Because I would think that B may be easier. It may be easier to dedicate one larger plot of land than to have different plots of land inside of, let's say, like an orchard or something.
yeah, I would say in the Midwest, typically, there are really large blocks of land, either farmland or forest or like a sprawled suburb. And in New Jersey, I would say it's more common to see like C. There's just
Oh,
so
okay.
many small farms here. And yeah, for whatever reason, like I don't know if it's the property is more expensive, could perhaps have something to do with it. Um, or like something about access to water and maybe like generally like I think sometimes city or state governments might try to protect forest or riparian zones like right by rivers. So sometimes that adds to a funky little shape of like area where you're allowed to farm, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
because I've spent now so much time looking at New Jersey from a satellite imagery point of view for my research. And I sometimes go to like Kansas as like a what's over here curiosity. And I would say we have a lot of different patches, a lot of turnover, and a lot of like variety of our landscape types here in New Jersey more so than most places. I don't know if that kind of answers your question.
I don't know. Yeah, that makes sense. I was just curious. I was trying to think about what if I've seen anything. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I have a question about the GIS kind of things remember you put up the map of Morris County, and I've
Mhm.
seen a lot of those with places that are trying to preserve land. And I'm always questioning you have a forest, and then you have meadow, and you have water, and you have this. But a forest isn't just a forest. There are some forests that are crap,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
there are some forests that are really rich, and others
Yeah.
totally invaded, by other kinds of plants. And I'm wondering and you may not know this because you're not in the field of preservation, so to speak,
Mhm.
exactly. Do they ground truth any of these kinds of things so that they know
Yeah.
they're dealing with a really important forest or a really important meadow versus one that who cares, you know?
Yeah. No, that's a great, great, great point. So for this particular venture from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, they have different levels of categories. So this is like the or broadest level, but they will classify agriculture very like forest. I think there's maybe 10 or so subcategories, like based on let's see. So they have some categories that are like Phragmites patch is like its own category in like the very specific category. They also will do it by canopy cover. So like I think it's like 30 to 50% canopy cover here. And then also sometimes by age of forest. So in New Jersey, so many of our forests are farmlands that have been left to regrow. And I believe NJDP has like perhaps even a specific layer out there, data layer out there based on how old the forest is. So
Yeah, that's
yes,
another thing that occurs to me is that
yeah,
with forests specifically, we've lost so much of our understory in
yeah,
many areas. And so you find, you know, you go someplace up in Stokes and you say, oh, isn't this wonderful? And then you go some other places and all the understory is gone or it's invasive. And
yeah,
how can you tell that from the air if you don't have boots on the ground, you know, uh, looking at
yeah.
these?
I will say the NJDP I kind of know a bit more information about because Rick Lathrop is a faculty member at Rutgers. He is kind of our GIS remote sensing guy, and he I think has a part in like doing that. And they do every 5 years. There's like a big ground truthing effort, but I don't know exactly how thorough they are. I do know there are people out there working on things like with imagery being able to like figure out codes of green color, like classify how green a forest is, and then have that tell them through artificial intelligence what is there. I just don't know like
Yeah.
how advanced that is now, and it's kind of crazy in just like a futuristic way.
But
But there are definitely people working on it.
looking at it from, you know, butterfly standpoint, let's say, there are
Yeah,
some species that are going to be eating the leaves of just things that are in mid-level or ground level, and others that are going to be in the canopies. So it would be helpful just from a butterfly standpoint to have a more detailed look at that. But I don't think there's any simple way to do that. That's something that
yeah, it's
people like us who trudge around
complicated.
and things, we know which ones we want to go to from being
Sure.
there before, you know, and you hope it's that the high quality layering
Mhm.
remains. So, but you mostly
Yeah,
it's
no, I appreciate you bringing that up because
thank you.
um I do know there's like drone methodology to like go lower in the canopy and with remote sensing, but it's not really my world. Um, but I think about this all the time. Like I'm calling a bunch of area forest that is actually very different habitat, but because of the scope of my study, I can't really go any more specific. I think I saw another chat, but now I can't find the little.
I got that. That was Edie. She said Garrett Mountain, for example, lost all of its understory to overpopulation of deer.
Hmm.
And Robert Soames wrote, LIDAR data is often used for stem density and getting at some of the understory vegetation density.
Yes, I forgot about LiDAR. Yes, thanks for adding
And does anyone have any other questions? Feel free to unmute, raise your hand if you're typing in the chat.
Yeah, it's Joyce Clowley.
Hi, Joyce.
How are you? Sorry I came late, but my computer kept crashing.
No, you're good.
Larger scale question, I guess. I was wondering if there have been any studies along the border wall between the US and Mexico, concerning the movement, well, of many different animals, but also, I guess, a particular interest to us would be how it might affect butterfly movements between our two countries. And of course, the border wall, you think, well, a butterfly can just fly over, but because of the extensive clearing of vegetation along the wall, I think that there could be a negative impact, and wondered if you're aware of any studies or the possibility of studies being undertaken.
I am not personally aware of any. I actually am curious, so I'm kind of just doing a quick Google Science. Here's one. Oh. Here's just a study I randomly found in a Google search. This is of interest. I haven't read it, so I don't know. But it's called Border Walls and Biodiversity, New Barriers, New Horizons.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely something really interesting to think about.
Yeah, certainly it would be. Obviously it will affect mammals, and of course the butterfly center is in Texas, and I wonder, I'm not aware of any studies. Maybe someone else more informed about it than I might know of any studies that have been put forth through NABA, perhaps. I don't know.
No, that's definitely really an interesting thing to think about. Thanks. Sorry, I can't be more helpful.
Last call for any questions before we adjourn for tonight. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I just was gonna, I guess not so much a question, but comment or compliment. I thought it was, a really excellent presentation. I really like some of the research you're doing, because like so much, some of the questions and comments about GIS is like GIS is like, and land use land cover is kind of like one of those tools and really gives you that 10,000 foot view. But then some of the on the ground stuff is so important, especially when it comes to connectivity, where it's like you may have physical connectivity between habitats, but whether it's suitable habitat and stepping stones, which are particularly important to butterflies, is the real critical question. It's like a bird can kind of move through to get to where it needs to go, but a butterfly may need those little step stones. So that's really kind of cool. And then I always like the IPM and like the pest type stuff, because there's been a lot of good research on like pollinators and bees and like the services provided by having natural landscapes around the farm, because you have all the native pollinators to offset, to help supplement any honeybees. And it's like the same thing goes for all those pest control services too. It's just kind of helps feed to that kind of discussion. So I thought it was an excellent presentation, and some good work you're doing there. Nice to see.
Thank you so much. That's really kind. I appreciate it.
Hi. With that, I am going